Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones that you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Now, many podcasts put their promotion and cup rattling stuff halfway through or towards the end, but because I'm hoping you're asleep long before we get there, I need to put this stuff up front. This show is brought to you with a lot of help from the supporters on Patreon. I hear from people all the time how valuable they find the show, and those supporters who have the means to help fund the show, to keep it going and help me reach new audiences, are very much appreciated. And I have to be honest with you, friends, in these times with the coronavirus lockdowns and stuff like that, it's very possible that without the support that I've received, I would not have been able to keep this show going, because I've been on short time and that, and I may not have been able to justify the expense of the hosting and stuff. So those people really were very important to keep this show going and make sure it is still up and running as it is. So if you're somebody who's making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you to deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to help to support the show, and most importantly, if you have the means and can afford to, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales or hit the link in the show notes or go from the website. You will have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvement of thousands of people besides yourselves. And over and above that, there are real rewards available from as little as $2 a month. That's over and above the knowledge that you are helping those insomniacs to get a good night's sleep. The rewards include early access to the weekly episode, weekly bonus episodes, and special edits of the main show itself. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank the 2 new supporters who signed up recently. There was Kara, sorry, I'm not too sure how you would pronounce it. I'm not sure where you're from. Here in South Africa, we would say Kara. But I know America, where most of the listeners are, or I suppose Canada would be Kara. Thank you very much for joining up, as well as also Lacey, who also had very nice things to say on Instagram. Thank you for your kind words, Lacey, and thanks to both of you for your support. And here's to many, many sleep, well-rested nights for you and your fellow insomniacs who you're helping out with your support on Patreon. Other than Patreon, there are other ways to support the show. There's the tip jar, the merchandise store, and others. But another huge way you can help the show is to simply spread the word. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just tell them. Let them know and spread the word. And if you recommend the show on social media, please make sure to tag me in so that I can see and I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. Something that also helps a lot is shares and reviews on Facebook. And I got a wonderful review recently from Pip, who had some very kind words, and who, according to her review, has yet to hear the end of an episode, which to me is one of the biggest compliments I can receive. And of course, as usual, I have to shout out the music, which is, as usual, is Un Desire by Kumiku. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive, and I've linked their website in the show notes, as they do different stuff under different names in different genres that I recommend taking a look. If you're a podcaster or a content creator, they probably have something that will be useful for you. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this waffle, and back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? It's a bit of a strange idea, isn't it? A podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. I'm someone who has struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. My parents had sleepless nights with me for many years, and even once I got old enough not to bother them anymore, sleep was always a struggle for me. It was quite a bit later in life when I discovered that droning voices, especially male ones, funny enough, have the tendency to act almost like a tranquilizer for me. I'd come to terms with the fact that I wasn't going to get any sleep at night, so I would queue up a couple of podcasts and lie in bed ready to lie awake all night, and find myself waking up having slept through everything that I was trying to listen to. I eventually discovered that there are podcasts out there specifically for the purpose of helping people sleep, and I tried a couple that worked very well for me, but when I recommended them to others, often they didn't resonate. And there was a couple of various reasons for it, including not liking the narrator's voice sometimes, or occasionally just not liking the sort of topic of it. So I thought to myself, I have a boring, droning male voice, so let me try to do my part to see if I can help others. Now, every episode starts with this long intro. Not everybody likes it, but it is here for a couple of very important reasons. Firstly, I need to explain the show to new listeners and explain the structure of it and how I think to engage with it and make a sort of case for why I think Sleepy Time Tales will be useful for you. And there's a sort of second reason for it as well. For people who've been listening to the show for a while, I obviously don't need to explain anything to them. But for most of them, this actual intro is an important part of helping them to get ready to sleep, to prepare themselves and prepare their space and their sort of mindset. Because what we're doing here is we're trying to build a space together, a cabin or a cave, somewhere comfortable to snuggle into. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of possible different ways to engage with the show. For me, when I listen to my sleep podcasts, I need something to actually focus on. I need a story or an event that lets me keep my mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxiety, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of sleep when it comes for me. Some people may need something a little bit different. In this day and age, white noise and that sort of thing is helpful to people. So maybe for you, you just need some background noise, something like the sound of the ocean, or wind in the trees, or rain, or just some boring dude droning on in the background. Tonight's story is a rather sad one, actually. It's the story of a young woman who goes off to the city and falls in love with a man who doesn't treat her well, and then she has a child, and who's brought up by the grandparents because of tragic events and the life that they start building for her, and a lot of unpleasant people trying to keep a very spirited young girl down. But I like these stories of young women who rise above their challenges to have great lives. So I think this is a rather sweet story, something to enjoy. But whatever the story is, it's very important that you don't try to force sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the story and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it is important you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night, it may not work for you. It may take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice. My accent may be strange for you. Maybe one episode just isn't long enough. So queue up a few episodes or just run through the backlog. What I do with my sleep podcasts is I just let them stream all night. I lie down in the dark with my earbuds in and let them run. Sometimes when I wake up at 3 a.m., the stream is still running and I let the voices waft me back to sleep. Sometimes even I wake up 30 or 60 minutes before my alarm goes. And I do exactly the same thing. pop my earbuds back in and just let myself go again. And you may wonder what the point is of doing that. Why sleep for an extra 30 or 60 minutes? And I got to tell you that sometimes that is absolutely, by a long shot, the best part of my night. There's something about just allowing yourself to relax right before the alarm goes that is just deeply, deeply satisfying. But however you engage with the show, whatever happens, it's very important that you try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you. So I ask that you give it a chance. I think actually if it's your first night, it's very possible that this won't work for you. I would suggest giving it a solid 2 or 3 nights chance to see if it does. Give yourself some time to see if you can trust me and relax around having me here as you sleep. And that's the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I'll tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe not so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way. To help you to face tomorrow and the day after, well rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. But what I need more than anything else is for you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Frustration is one of the greatest enemies of a good night's sleep. And the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep and to a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it is not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life, and supposed progress shining bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Lena Rivers by Mary Jane Holmes. Preface. If it be true, as some have said, that a secret is safer in a preface than elsewhere, it would be worse than folly for me to waste the midnight oil in the manufacture of an article which no one would read, and which would serve no purpose save the adding of a page or so to a volume perhaps already too large. But I do not think so. I watch of a few who, with a horror of anything savouring of humbug, wade industriously through a preface, be it never so lengthy, hoping therein to find the moral, without which the story would of course be valueless. To such I would say, seek no further. For though I claim for Lena Rivers a moral, yes, 6 morals if you please, I shall not put them in the preface, as I prefer having them sought after. For what I have written, I wish to have read. Bred among the rugged hills of Bay State, and for a time constantly associated with a class of people known the wide world over as Yankees, it is no more natural that I should often write of the places and scenes with which I have been most familiar. In my delineations of New England character, I have aimed to copy from memory, and in no one instance, I believe, have I overdrawn the pictures. For among the New England mountains there lives many a Granny Nichols, a Joel Slocum, or a Nancy Scovendike, while the wide world holds more than one Lena with her high temper, extreme beauty, rare combination of those qualities which makes the female character so lovely. Nearly the same remarks will apply to my portraits of Kentucky life and character, for it has been my good fortune to spend a year and a half in that state, and in my descriptions of country lanes and country life, I have with few exceptions copied from what I saw. Mrs. Livingston and Mrs. Graham are characters found everywhere, while the impulsive John Jr. and the generous-hearted Durwood represent a class of individuals who belong more exclusively to the sunny South. I have endeavored to make this book both a good and an interesting one, and if I failed in my attempt, it is too late to remedy it now. Such as it is, I give it to the world, trusting that the same favor and forbearance which have been awarded to my other works will also be extended to this. Signed M.J.H., Brockport, New York, October 1856. Lena Rivers. Chapter 1. Lena. For many days the storm continued. Highways were blocked up, while roads less frequented were rendered wholly impassable. The oldest inhabitants of Oakland had never seen the like before, and they shook their grey heads ominously as over and adown the New England mountains the howling wind swept furiously, now shrieking exultingly as one by one the huge forest trees bent before its power, and again dying away in a low, sad wail as it shook the casement of some low-roofed cottage, where the blazing fire, piled high upon the hearth, danced merrily to the sound of the storm wind, and then, whirling in a fantastic circle, disappeared up the broad-mouthed chimney. For nearly a week there was scarcely a sign of life in the streets of Oakland, but at the end of that time the storm abated, and the December sun, emerging from its dark hiding place, once again looked smilingly down upon the white untrodden snow, which covered the earth for miles and miles around. Rapidly the roads were broken, paths were made on the narrow sidewalk, and then the villagers bethought themselves of their mountain neighbors, who might perchance have suffered from the severity of the storm. Far up the mountainside in an old yellow farmhouse which had withstood the blasts of many a winter, lived Grandfather and Grandmother Nichols, as they were familiarly called, and ere the sun setting arrangements were made for paying them a visit. Oakland was a small rural village, nestled among rocky hills where the word fashion was seldom heard, and where many of the primitive customs of our forefathers still prevailed. Consequently, neither the buxom maidens nor the hale old matrons felt in the least disgraced as they piled promiscuously upon the 4-ox sled, which ere long was moving slowly through the mammoth drifts which lay upon the mountain road. As they drew near the farmhouse, they noticed that the blue paper curtains which shaded the windows of Grandma Nichols' spare room were rolled up, while the faint glimmer of a tallow candle within indicated that the room possessed an occupant. Who could it be? Possibly it was John, a proud man who lived in Kentucky, and who, to please his wealthy bride, exchanged the plebeian name of Nichols for that of Livingston, which his high-born lady fancied was more aristocratic in its sounding. And if it be John, said the passengers of the ox sled, with whom that gentleman was no great favourite, if it be John, we'll take ourselves home as fast as we can. Satisfied with this resolution, they kept on their way until they reached the wide gateway, where they were met by Mr. Nichols, whose greeting they fancied was less cordial than usual. With a simple "how do you do," he led the way into the spacious kitchen, which answered the treble purpose of dining room, sitting room, and cook room. Grandma Nichols too appeared somewhat disturbed, but she met her visitors with an air which seemed to say she was determined to make the best of her trouble, whatever it might be. The door of the spare room was slightly ajar, and while the visitors were disrobing, one young girl, more curious than the rest, peered cautiously in, exclaiming as she did so, "Mother, mother, Helena is in there on a bed, pale as a ghost." "Yes, Helena is there," interrupted Grandma Nichols, who overheard the girl's remark. "She got home the first night of the storm, and what's queerer than all, she's been married better than a year." "Married? Married? Helena married? Who to? Where's her husband?" asked a dozen voices in the same breath. Grandfather Nichols groaned as if in pain, and his wife, glancing anxiously towards the door of her daughter's room, said in reply to the last question, "That's the worst of it. He was some grand rascal who lived at the Southern and came up here to see what he could do. He thought Helene was handsome, I suppose, and married her, making her keep it still because his folks in Carolina wouldn't like it. Of course, he got sick of her, and just before the baby was born, he gave her $500 and left her." A murmur of surprise ran around the room, accompanied with a look of incredulity, which Grandma Nichols quickly divined, and while her withered cheek crimsoned at the implied disgrace, she added in an elevated tone of voice, "It's as true as the Bible. Old Father Blanchard's son that used to preach here married them, and Helene brought us a letter from him saying it was true. Here it is. Read it yourselves if you don't believe me." And she drew from a side drawer a letter, on the back of which the villagers recognized the well-remembered handwriting of their former pastor. This proof of Helena's innocence was hardly relished by the clever gossips of Oakland, for the young girl, though kind-hearted and gentle, was far too beautiful to be a general favorite. Mothers saw in her a rival for their daughters, while the daughters looked enviously upon her clear white brow and shining chestnut hair, which fell in wavy curls about her neck and shoulders. 2 years before our story opens, she had left her mountain home to try the mysteries of millinery in the city, where a distant relative of her mother was living. Here her uncommon beauty attracted much attention, drawing ere long to her side a wealthy young Southerner, who, just freed from the restraints of college life, found it vastly agreeable making love to the fair Helena. Simple-minded and wholly unused to the ways of the world, she believed each word he said, and when at last he proposed marriage, she not only consented, but also promised to keep it a secret for a time, until he could in a measure reconcile his father, who he feared might disinherit him for wedding a penniless bride. "Wait, darling, until he knows you," said he, "and then he will gladly welcome you as his daughter." According to one dark wintry night, when neither moon nor stars were visible, Helena stole softly from a quiet room at Mrs. Warren's, and in less than an hour was the lawful bride of Harry Rivers, the wife of the clergyman alone witnessing the ceremony. "I wish I could take you home at once," said young Rivers, who was less a rascal than a coward. "I wish I could take you home at once, but it cannot be. We must wait a while." So Helena went back to Mrs. Warren's, where for a few weeks she stayed, and then, saying she was going home, she left and became the mistress of a neat little cottage, which stood a mile or two from the city. Here for several months young Rivers devoted himself entirely to her happiness, seeming to forget that there was aught else in the world save his beautiful Lena, as he was wont to call her. But at last there came a change. Harry seemed sad and absent-minded, though ever kind to Helena, who strove in vain to learn the cause of his uneasiness. One morning when, later than usual, she awoke, she missed him from her side, and on the table near her lay a letter containing the following. "Forgive me, darling, that I leave you so abruptly. Circumstances render it necessary, but be assured I shall come back again. In the meantime, you had better return to your parents, where I will seek you. Enclosed are $500, enough for your present need. Farewell. H. Rivers." There was one bitter cry of hopeless anguish, and when Helena Rivers again awoke to perfect consciousness, she lay in a darkened room. Soft footsteps passed in and out, kind faces in which were mingled pity and reproach. Bent anxiously over her, while at her side lay a little tender thing, her infant daughter, 3 weeks old. And now there rose within her a strong desire to see once more her childhood home, to lay her aching head upon her mother's lap and pour out the tale of grief which was crushing the life from her young heart. As soon, therefore, as her health would permit, she started for Oakland, taking the precaution to procure from the clergyman who had married her a letter confirming the fact. Wretched and weary, she reached her home at the dusk of evening, and with a bitter cry fell fainting in the arms of her mother, who, having heard regularly from her, never dreamed that she was elsewhere than in the employ of Mrs. Warren. With streaming eyes and trembling hands, the old man and his wife made ready the spare room for the wanderer, more than once blessed the fearful storm which, for a time at least, would keep the prying eyes of those who, they feared, would hardly credit their daughter's story. And their fears were right, for many of those who visited them on the night of which we have spoken disbelieved the tale, mentally pronouncing the clergyman's letter a forgery, got up by Helena to deceive her parents. Consequently, of the few who from time to time came to the old farmhouse, nearly all were actuated by motives of curiosity rather than by feelings of pity for the young girl mother, who, though feeling their neglect, scarcely heeded it. Strong in the knowledge of her own innocence, she lay day after day, watching and waiting for one who never came. But at last, as days glided into weeks, and weeks into months, hope died away, and turning wearily upon her pillow, she prayed that she might die. And when the days grew bright and gladsome in the warm spring sun, when the snow was melted off from the mountain tops, and the first robin's note was heard by the farmhouse door, Helena laid her baby on her mother's bosom, and without a murmur glided down the dark, broad river whose deep waters move onward and upward, but never return. When it was known in Oakland that Helena was dead, there came a reaction, and those who had been loudest in their condemnation were now the first to hasten forward with offers of kindness and words of sympathy. But neither tears nor regrets could recall to life the fair young girl, who, wondrously beautiful even in death, slept calmly in her narrow coffin, a smile of sadness wreathing her lips as if her last prayer had been for one who had robbed her thus early of happiness and life. In the bright green valley at the foot of the mountain, they buried her, and the old father, as he saw the damp earth fall upon her grave, asked that he too might die. But his wife, younger by several years, prayed to live that she might protect and care for the little orphan, who, first by its young mother's tears, and again by the waters of the baptismal fountain, was christened Helena Rivers, the Lena of our story. Chapter 2. John. 10 years of sunlight and shadow have passed away, and the little grave at the foot of the mountain is now grass-grown and sunken. 10 times have the snows of winter fallen on the hoary head of Grandfather Nichols, bleaching his thin locks to their own whiteness and bending his sturdy frame until now the old man lay dying in the same blue-curtained room where years agone his only daughter was born, and where 10 years before she had died. Carefully did Mrs. Nichols nurse him, watching, weeping, and praying that he might live, while little Lena gladly shared her grandmother's vigils, hovering ever by the bedside of her grandfather, who seemed more quiet when her soft hands smoothed his tangled hair, or wiped the cold moisture from his brow. The villagers, too, remembering their neglect, when once before death had brooded over the mountain farmhouse, now daily came with offers of assistance. But one thing still was wanting. John, their only remaining child, was absent, and the sick man's heart grew sad, and his eyes dim with tears, as day by day went by, and still he did not come. Several times had Lena written to her uncle, apprising him of his father's danger, and once only had he answered. It was a brief, formal letter, written evidently under some constraint. But it said that he was coming, and with childish joy the old man had placed it beneath his pillow, withdrawing it occasionally for Lena to read again, particularly the passage, "Dear Father, I am sorry you are sick." "Heaven bless him, I know he's sorry," Mr. Nichols would say. "He was always a good boy, and is a good boy now. Ain't he, Martha?" And mother-like, Mrs. Nichols would answer, "Yes," forcing back the while the tears which would start when she thought how long the good boy had neglected them. 18 years having elapsed since he had crossed the threshold of his home. With his hand plighted to one of the village maidens, he had left Oakland to seek his fortune, going first to New York, then to Ohio, and finally wending his way southward to Kentucky. Here he remained, steadily falling into the luxurious habits of those around him, and gradually forgetting the low-roofed farmhouse far away to the northward, where dwelt a grey-haired pair and a beautiful young girl, his parents and his sister. She to whom his vows were plighted was neither grateful nor cultivated, and when occasionally her tall, spare figure and uncouth manners arose before him, in contrast with the fair forms around him, he smiled derisively at the thoughts of making her his wife. About this time there came from New Orleans a wealthy invalid, with his only daughter, Matilda. She was a proud, haughty girl whose disposition, naturally unamiable, was rendered still worse by disappointment from which she was suffering. Accidentally, Mr. Richards, her father, made the acquaintance of John Nichols, conceiving for him a violent fancy, and finally securing him as a constant companion. For several weeks John appeared utterly oblivious to the presence of Matilda, who, accustomed to adulation, began at last to feel piqued at his neglect, and to strive in many ways to attract his attention. John, who was ambitious, met her advances more than halfway, and finally, encouraged by her father, offered her his heart and hand. Under other circumstances, Matilda would undoubtedly have spurned him with contempt, but having heard that her recreant lover was about taking to himself a bride, she felt a desire, as she expressed it, to let him know she could marry too. And accordingly John was accepted, on condition that he changed the name of Nichols, which Miss Richards particularly disliked, to that of Livingston. This was easily done, and the next letter, which went to Oakland, carried the news of John's marriage with the proud Matilda. A few months later, Mr. Richards died, leaving his entire property to his daughter and her husband. John was now richer far than even in his wildest dreams he had ever hoped to be, and yet, like many others, he found that riches alone could not ensure happiness. And indeed, to be happy with Matilda Richards seemed impossible. Proud, avaricious, and overbearing, she continually tortured her husband with his entire dependence upon her, carefully watching him lest any of her hoarded wealth should find its way to the scanty purse of his parents, of whom she always spoke with contempt. Never but once had they asked for aid, and that to help them rear the little Lena. Influenced by his wife, John replied sneeringly, scouting the idea of Helena's marriage, denounced her as a sister, and saying of her child that the poor house stood ready for such as she. This letter Lena had accidentally found among her grandfather's papers, and though its contents gave her no definite impression concerning her mother, it inspired her with a dislike for her uncle, whose coming she greatly dreaded, for it was confidently expected that she, together with her grandmother, would return with him to Kentucky. "You'll be better off there than here," said her grandfather one day when speaking of the subject. "Your Uncle John is rich and you'll grow up a fine lady." "I don't want to be a lady. I won't be a lady," stared Lena passionately. "I don't like Uncle John. He called my mother a bad woman and me a little brat. I hate him." And the beautiful brown eyes glittered with tears, flashed forth their anger quite as eloquently as language could express it. The next moment, Lena was bending over her grandfather, asking to be forgiven for the hasty words which she knew had caused him pain. "I'll try to like him," said she, as the palsied hand stroked her disordered curls in token of forgiveness. "I'll try to like him," adding mentally, "but I do hope he won't come." It would seem that Lena's wish was to be granted, for weeks glided by and there came no tidings of the absent one. Daily, Mr. Nichols grew weaker, and when there was no longer hope of his life, his heart yearned more and more to be once more to behold his son, to hear again ere he died the blessed name of father. "Lena," said Mrs. Nichols one afternoon when her husband seemed worse, "Lena, it is time for the stage, and you run down to the turn and see if your uncle's come. Something tells me he'll be here tonight." Lena obeyed, and throwing on her faded calico sunbonnet, she was soon at the turn, a point in the road from which the village hotel was plainly discernible. The stage had arrived, and Lena saw that one of the passengers evidently intended stopping, for he seemed to be giving directions concerning his baggage. "That's Uncle John, I most know," thought she, and seating herself on a rock beneath some white birches, so common in New England, she awaited his approach. She was right in her conjecture, for the stranger was John Livingston, returned after many years, but so changed that the jolly landlord who had known him when a boy, and with whom he had cracked many a joke, now hardly dared to address him, he seemed so cold and haughty. "I will leave my trunk here for a few days," said John, "and perhaps I shall wish for a room. Got any decent accommodations?" "Wonder if you don't calculate your sleep, Tom," thought the landlord, replying at the same instant. "Yes, sir, tip-top accommodations. Ain't more than a few beds in any room, and nowadays we always have a washbowl and pitcher. Don't go to the sink as we used to when you lived around here." With a gesture of impatience, Mr. Livingston left the house and started up the mountain road, where Lena still kept her watch. Oh, how that walk recalled to him the memories of other days, which came thronging about him as one by one familiar waymarks appeared, reminding him of his childhood when he roamed over that mountainside with those who were now scattered far and wide. Some on the deep blue sea, some at the distant west, and others far away across the dark river of death. He had mingled much with the world since last he had traversed that road, and his heart had grown callous and indifferent. But he was not entirely hardened, and when at the turn in the road he came suddenly upon the tall walnut tree, on whose shaggy bark his name was carved, together with that of another, a maiden, he started as if smitten with a heavy blow, and dashing a tear from his eye, he exclaimed, "Oh, that were I were a boy again." From her seat on the mossy rock, Lena had been watching him. She was very ardent and impulsive, strong in her likes and dislikes, but quite ready to change the latter if she saw any indications of improvement in the person disliked. For her uncle she had conceived a great aversion, and when she saw him approaching, thrusting aside the thistles and dandelions with his golden-headed cane, she mimicked the motions, wondering if he didn't feel big because he wore a large gold chain dangling from his jacket pocket. But when she saw his emotions beneath the walnut tree, her opinion suddenly changed. A very bad man wouldn't cry, she thought, and springing to his side, she grasped his hand, exclaiming, I know you're my Uncle John, and I'm real glad you've come. Granny thought you never would, and Grandpa asks for you all the time. Had his buried sister arisen before him, Mr. Livingston would hardly have been more startled, for in form and feature Lena was exactly what her mother had been at her age. The same clear complexion, large brown eyes and wavy hair, and the tones of her voice too. How they thrilled the heart of the strong man, making him a boy again, guiding the steps of his baby sister, or bearing her gently in his arms when the path was steep and stony. It was but a moment, however, and then the vision faded. His sister was dead, and the little girl before him was her child. The child of shame, he believed, or rather his wife had said it so often that he began to believe it. Glancing at the old womanish garb in which Mrs. Nichols always arrayed her, a smile of mingled scorn and pity curled his lips, as though he thought of presenting her to his fastidious wife and elegant daughters. Then, withdrawing the hand which she had taken, he said, "And you are Lena? Lena Nichols, they call you, I suppose?" Lena's old dislike began to return, and placing both hands upon her hips in imitation of her grandmother, she replied, "No, 'tain't Lena Nichols neither. 'Tis Lena Rivers. Granny says so, and the town clerk has got it so in his book. How are my cousins? Are they pretty well? And how is Aunt?" Missy Livingston winced, at the same time feeling amused at this little specimen of Yankeeism, in which she saw so much of his mother. Poor little Lena, how should she know any better, living as she always had with two old people, whose language savoured so much of the days before the flood? Some such thought passed through Mr. Livingston's mind, and very civilly he answered her concerning the health of her cousins and aunt, proceeding next to the question of his father, who, she said, had never seen a well day since her mother died. "Is there anyone with him except your grandmother?" asked Mr. Livingston, and Lena replied, "Aunt Nancy Scovendike has been with us a few days and is there now." At the sound of that name, John started, colouring so deeply that Lena observed it, and asked if he knew Miss Scovendike. "I used to," said he, while Lena continued, "She's a nice woman, and though she ain't any connection, I call her aunt. Granny thinks a sight of her." Miss Scovendike was evidently an unpleasant topic for Mr. Livingston, and changing the subject, he said, "What makes you say Granny, child?" Lena blushed painfully. 'Twas the first word she had ever uttered, her grandmother having taught it to her, and encouraged her in its use. Besides that, Lena had a great horror of anything which she fancied was all stuck up, and thinking an entire change from granny to grandmother would be altogether too much. She still persisted in occasionally using her favourite word, in spite of the ridicule it frequently called forth from her school companions. Thinking to herself that it was none of her uncle's business what she called her grandmother, she made no reply. And in a few moments they came in sight of the yellow farmhouse, which looked to Mr. Livingston just as it did when he left it 18 years before. There was the tall poplar with its green leaves rustling in the breeze, just as they had done years ago, when from a distant hilltop he looked back to catch the last glimpse of his home. The well in the rear was the same, the lilac bushes in front, the tansy patch on the right, and the gable-roofed barn on the left. All were there, nothing was changed but himself. Mechanically he followed Lena into the yard, half expecting to see bleaching upon the grass the same web of homemade cloth which he remembered had lain there when he went away. One thing alone seemed strange. The blue paper curtains were rolled away from the spare room windows, which were open as if to admit as much air as possible. "I shouldn't wonder if Grandpa was worse," said Lena, hurrying him along and ushering him at once into the sick room. At first Mrs. Nicholl did not observe him, for she was bending tenderly over the white wrinkled face which lay upon the small scanty pillow. John thought how small and scanty they were, while he almost shuddered at the sound of his footsteps upon the carpeted floor. Everything was dreary and comfortless, and his conscience reproached him that his old father should die so poor when he counted his money by the thousands. As he passed the window, his tall figure obscured the fading daylight, causing his mother to raise her head, and in a moment her long bony arms were twined around his neck. The cruel letter, his long neglect, were all forgotten in the joy of once again beholding her darling boy, whose bearded cheek she kissed again and again. John was unused to such demonstrations of affection, except indeed from his little golden-haired Anna, who was refined and polished and all that, which made a vast difference, as he thought. Still he returned his mother's greeting with a tolerably good grace, managing, however, to tear himself from her as soon as possible. "How is my father?" he asked, and his mother replied. "He grew worse right away after Lena went out, and he seemed so put to it for breath that Nancy went to the doctor." Here a movement from the invalid arrested her attention, and going to the bedside she saw that he was awake. Bending over him, she whispered softly, "John has come. Would you like to see him?" Quickly the feeble arms were outstretched, as if to feel what could not be seen, for the old man's eyesight was dim with the shadows of death. Taking both his father's hands in his, John said, "Here I am, Father. Can't you see me?" "No, John, no, I can't see you." And the poor man wept like a little child. Soon growing more calm, he continued, "Your voice is the same that it was years ago when you lived with us at home. That hasn't changed, though they say your name has." "Oh, John, my boy, how could you do so? 'Twas a good name, my name, and you the only one left to bear it. What made you do so, oh John, John?" Mr. Livingstone did not reply, and after a moment his father again spoke. "John, lay your hand on my forehead. It's cold as ice. I am dying, and your mother will be left alone. We are poor, my son, poorer than you think. The homestead is mortgaged for all it's worth, and there are only a few dollars in the purse. Oh, I worked so hard to earn them for her and the girl, Lena's child. Now, John, promise me that when I am gone I shall go with you to your home in the West. Promise, and I shall die happy." This was a new idea to John, and for a time he hesitated. He glanced at his mother. She was ignorant and peculiar, but she was his mother still. He looked at Lena. She was beautiful. He knew that, but she was odd and old-fashioned. He thought of his haughty wife, his headstrong son, and his imperious daughter. What would they say if he made that promise? For if he made it, he would keep it. A long time his father awaited his answer, and then he spoke again. "Won't you give your old mother a home?" The voice was weaker than when it spoke before, and John knew that life was fast ebbing away, for the brow on which his hand was resting was cold and damp with the moisture of death. He could no longer refuse, and the promise was given. The next morning, the deep-toned bell of Oakland told that another soul was gone, and the villagers, as they counted the 3 strokes and 10, knew that Grandfather Nichols was numbered with the dead. Chapter 3. Packing Up. The funeral was over, and in the quiet valley by the side of his only daughter, Grandfather Nichols was laid to rest. As far as possible, his father's business was settled, and then John began to speak of his returning. More than once had he repented of the promise made to his father, and as the time passed on, he shrank more and more from introducing his plebeian mother to his lady wife, who he knew was meditating an open rebellion. Immediately after his father's death, he had written to his wife, telling her all, and trying as far as he was able to smooth matters over, so that his mother might at least have a decent reception. In a violent passion, his wife had answered that she would never submit to it, never. "When I married you," said she, "I didn't suppose I was marrying the old woman, young one and all. And as for my having them to maintain, I will not. So, Mr. John Nichols, you understand it." When Mrs. Livingston was particularly angry, she called her husband Mr. John Nichols. And when Mr. John Nichols was particularly angry, he did as he pleased. So in this case, he replied that he should bring home as many old women and young ones as he liked, and she might help herself if she could. This state of things was hardly favourable to the future happiness of Grandma Nichols, who, wholly unsuspecting and deeming herself as good as anybody, never dreamed that her presence would be unwelcome to her daughter-in-law, whom she thought to assist in various ways, taking past the whole heft of the housework upon herself. Though she added, "I mean to begin just as I can hold out. I've heard of such things as sons' wives shirking the whole on their own to the old mothers, and the minute Tilda showed any signs of that, I shall back out, I tell you." John, who overheard this remark, bit his lip with vexation, and then burst into a laugh as he fancied the elegant Mrs. Livingston's dismay at hearing herself called Tilda. Had John chosen, he could have given his mother a few useful hints with regard to her treatment of his wife, but such an idea never entered his brain. He was a man of few words and generally allowed himself to be controlled by circumstances, thinking that the easiest way of getting through the world. He was very proud and keenly felt how mortifying it would be to present his mother to his fashionable acquaintances, but that was in the future, many miles away. He wouldn't trouble himself about it now, so he passed his time mostly in rambling through the woods and over the hills, while his mother, good soul, busied herself with the preparations for her journey, inviting each and every one of her neighbours to be sure and visit her if they ever came that way, and urging some of them to come on purpose and spend the winter. Among those who promised compliance with the last request was Miss Nancy Scovendike, whom we have once before mentioned, and who, as the reader will have inferred, was the first love of John Livingston. On the night of his arrival, she had been sent in quest of the physician, and when on her return she learned from Lena that he had come, she kept out of sight, thinking she should wait a while before she met him. Not that she cared a snap of her finger for him, she said, only it was natural that she should hate to see him. But when the time did come, she met it bravely, shaking his hand and speaking to him as if nothing had ever happened. And while he was wondering how he could have fancied her, she too was mentally styling herself a fool for having liked such a prissy, overgrown thing. Dearly did Miss Nancy love excitement, and during the days that Mrs. Nichols was packing up, she was busy helping her to stow away the crockery, which the old lady declared should go. Particularly the blue set, which she had ever since the day but one before John was born, and which she intended as part of Lena's setting out. Then too John's wife could use them when she had a good deal of company, could save buying new, and every little helped. "I wonder now if Tilda takes snuff," said Mrs. Nichols one day, seating herself upon an empty dry goods box which stood in the middle of the floor, helping herself to an enormous pinch of her favourite Macaboy. "I wonder if she takes snuff, because if she does, we shall take a sight of comfort together." "I don't much believe she does," answered Miss Nancy, whose face was very red, with trying to cram a pair of cracked bellows into the already crowded top of John's leathern trunk. "I don't believe she does, for somehow it seems to me she's a mighty nipped-up thing, not an atom like you nor me." "Like enough," returned Mrs. Nichols, finishing her snuff and wiping her fingers upon the corner of her checked apron. "But Nancy, can you tell me how in the world I'm ever going to carry this mop? It's brand new, never been used above a dozen times, and I can't afford to give it away." At this, John, who was sitting in the adjoining room, came forward. Hitherto he had not interfered in the least in his mother's arrangements, but had looked silently on while she packed away article after article which she would never need, and which undoubtedly would be consigned to the flames the moment her back was turned. The mop business, however, was too much for him. And before Miss Nancy had time to reply, he said, "For heaven's sake, Mother, how many traps do you propose taking? What do you imagine we can do with a mop? Why, I dare say not one of my servants would know how to use it. And it's a wonder if some of the little chaps I didn't take it for a horse before night." And I'm going to call it there for tonight. If you've enjoyed the story, you can find the book at the link in the show notes to find it on Project Gutenberg. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Desert by Kumiku. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.